Good. Well, hello to everyone, and welcome to all of you. For those of you who were here for the first webinar, thanks for being here again today. And for those of you who could not be with us before, I'm really glad that you can be here today. What we've begun to talk about is the research to date about how our brain operates in making decisions, and then applying these insights to why organizations, groups, and individuals function or don't function so well. What we're going to do is to continue to follow the lean leadership development model. And you'll recall in the first session we really talked about self-development. Also, we're going to use the diagram from the Ballet's book, Lead with Respect, and really talk about from the brain perspective, continue to talk about from the brain perspective why these practices are so important. And so really any organization is most successful when each person is successful in what they do. There's often a tension between these, and this results in the resistance we observe as people respond to this conflict. Our brain does not really resist changing. What our brain resists is a change that it doesn't deem to be in its best interest, a change that doesn't carry a very good likelihood for success. Your idea might be quite well and work well from your perspective, but not necessarily for someone else. In fact, your idea may be correct, it just may not be the best one available. So what's going on is the brain observes the circumstances, applies its sorting criteria to what it thinks is important, and then makes a decision. That decision is either to defend what it believes to be the truth or challenge it. And this is something that's going on moment by moment, issue by issue, and much of it happening outside of our awareness. So as we saw in the first webinar, the studies indicate a very inconvenient truth, which is that you can't depend on your brain for an accurate appraisal of the current situation. Is that possible? Georgie, comments?
Well, yeah, as you're talking through this one more time now, I'm thinking about me being the manager, the boss, and I'm talking now to an employee, and I'm saying, listen, employee or associate or team leader, team member, we have to do this. We have a challenge to meet, and this is like a catch-ball session to some degree. We have a challenge to meet. How are we able to do it? So I'm focusing them on the challenge. By doing that, I'm not necessarily uncovering resistance to me. I'm uncovering resistance to the process or the goal or the methodology. But as a coach, shouldn't you be given a little more respect from the standpoint of somebody listening to you and maybe giving you less resistance? And then Norman says, Norman, you're going to have to tell me a little bit about exactly how you say what resistance looks like and how us as managers, we got to stop resisting. And this is one of the key things holding us back as leaders. And then a question will come out of that for you, Mark. Go ahead, Norm.
Okay. Okay, thank you. First of all, 100% agree with Mark. And we're really, as George just said, there are two levels of this resistance. One is the personal resistance. And of course, we meet resistance on something new. And that is very positive, very good. It indicates, this is a real challenge for you. And if you want to grow in this life, if you want to really develop yourself, then you recognize the resistance and you find ways to overcome it. And what George said is very good about this brain. But I want to add to that. The brain only knows fundamentally the past. The brain is like a computer. So you experience things in life and you store it, and then you want to make a decision today on something's happening today, and you want to draw on the brain, but the brain only knows the past. But there's something deeper inside you, not listening to that brain, not listening to that thought, but there's something deep inside you. Every single person has this ability to act spontaneously to solve this current problem. It'll come through you. Where it comes from, I don't know. I call it a higher source. I call it your spiritual self. that it's inside you and you can address that problem. Okay, there's another resistance, which George also alluded to, which is the resistance of the boss. People come to my workshop, or they come to my, they hear me keynote a conference, and they like when I talk about my subjects that I discover in Japan, because that's what I've done for 30 years, is I go to Japan and I discover the best of what they do and I bring it to the West. And my latest discovery I call the Harada method. We might talk a little bit about this later. And people get very excited about this. They said, gee, let's do it in our company. And they go back to the boss and they said, look, you sent me to the conference. I learned this great method. Let's try it here. And the boss says, no, can't do it here. That's the resistance that you get. That's the natural resistance that comes from a leader. A leader doesn't want change. The leader, might say that they want change from you, but they don't want to change. They'll say, we don't have enough money in the budget. We haven't tried it before. It's not going to work here, and et cetera. I'm sure close to 99% of the time, the boss is going to say no. That's resistance. To me, there are 9 wastes. Ono came up with 7 wastes that you should be familiar with in the lean community. I sort of coined 2 more. One, the 8th waste is the underutilization of people's talents. And the 9th waste is managers' resistance to change. It exists with every manager. Now, what does it do to an organization? It kills creativity.
Coaching and developing others, because here's where the rubber meets the road, as Norm and George, as you were alluding to in what you were talking about. And with respect to the Lead with Respect book, we start to move down their practices and incorporate these as well. And particularly, we're going to see why this is so important. So self-development means honoring the basic premise. Why? Because you cannot trust your brain. Why is that? Because your brain concocts a story that's not necessarily reflect what's really happening. And it does this to respond to its main criteria for success, which is survival. This means in the near term having the capability to respond to the threat, but in the long run having the energy to keep going. If you spend the time and energy to gather all the details, that takes too long. So your brain just gathers enough to form a good enough explanation, to get enough pixels into the image so it can direct action. We know we have to be able to act, and we have to believe that we're right, because we have to be able to act in the face of that. That leaves only one small problem, which is that your choice may work perfectly well for you, based on how you observe the circumstances and based on what you're most concerned about. It may be the best choice, but it may not be the best decision.
Sure, Ira. One of the things that's striking me, and I haven't heard the term used except by Norman in one instance, is trust. You're talking about the amygdala versus the prefrontal cortex. Once a group develops a trust in each other that they're not going to be attacked for bringing out their ideas, etc., I think the shift can be made to the prefrontal cortex. But how do you build that trust so that the people can feel comfortable in bringing out the different perspectives?
Absolutely, and we're going to be getting that in just a little bit.
Yeah, I would like to talk about that too, because there are so few organizations in America that don't have that fear. Deming talks about you got to root out fear, but where is it? Maybe it's at Google, maybe it's in Apple, but it's in very few companies in America. I mean, every day you read the paper, HP just laid off 20,000 people. There's so much fear that exists out there that kills this creativity.
Yep. And this is a direct quote from that study. People in positions of power tend to act in a self-interested manner and display reduced interpersonal sensitivity to their powerless counterparts. The more power and control you have in a given situation, the less likely you are to incorporate the views of others, the less likely it is that you'll amend your story once you've made it. So what these studies suggest is that we are less inclined to engage with others and less likely to listen and to hear them, less capable of doing the very thing that we have to do, which is to challenge our story. And that's true whether you're a participant, a leader, or a coach. Well, your reaction is they don't get it. Well, you know what? they don't. So, let me ask you, what does this look like for a leader, for instance? And I'm talking about leader in the generic sense, not the organizational chart sense. So I'm talking about, again, just to get our terms straight, I'm talking about anytime you have an idea about things where you think things should be headed, what should be done, how people should be doing something, and this is whether you're a CEO, supervisor, or frontline staff, you're acting in the leader role. And anytime you're part of crafting changes, whether as a leader or a participant, you're a player. And when you're asked to do something differently, you're a participant. So you have leaders, you have participants, both are considered players. And anytime you're supporting a person or a player through their process with an issue, you're coaching. So as an organizational leader, what's your job? It's to define where the company's going, where the organization needs to go, set the direction, and set the parameters for success. And most often, that leader has a really good idea of how it should be done. And in this view, the participants should and will line up behind the change and adapt what they're doing because it's a great idea. But of course, that's not what we actually see, right? Some people resist and fight the change. And sure, there are some who say yes and mean it, but there's some who say yes and then don't follow through. Others will say no, but some of those are still willing to consider the possibilities. So you see, resistance has many faces. And of course, not all those faces are a problem. Some of those faces give you an opportunity. However, what do we often see? Accountability, compliance, alignment, being a team player, usually directed at those who are resisting, usually intended as a strong encouragement or else a threat or opportunity. The point is that someone defending is not necessarily in their amygdala, fixed in their view. They may be what I call a dissenter, someone with a valid reason to fight the change based on their view and their sorting criteria. Just because someone's resisting doesn't necessarily mean they aren't in their challenging mode. And likewise, someone who appears to be on board doesn't necessarily mean that they are. A spectator is somebody who's just hedging their bets. They're playing along, not willing to participate, and really just protecting themselves. Of course, they don't want to be left out if it happens to work. They're just trying to protect themselves. So the challenge then is we have to recognize resistance that represents the voice of the amygdala versus resistance that represents a dissenting view. And the reason for this is that I'll both provide you an opportunity. Both these people are in different places and need a different approach. Otherwise, you just run the risk of forcing them deeper into their amygdala, protecting themselves, and frustrating you.
Larry, what about Horenzo doesn't work for you? Can you answer that, Larry?
Let me frame it just a little bit differently, George. I think for every individual and every team, you have a sphere of authority, a circle of authority, and then you have a circle of influence, right? I can influence what LLI does. I can't control it. I don't have authority over it. But I do have authority over my course, let's say, right? You can influence my course, but you don't have authority over it. So there are these two spheres, and that's true both for the individual and for a team. And it's true for the CEO of a company. So I think if you frame things that way, I think it makes it a little bit easier. But just one other comment while I have the floor. I've spent 40 years consulting and doing organization design and employee empowerment and blah, 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 blah. The key word that hasn't come up in this discussion is ownership. And when I just finished a redesign project up in Canada with a healthcare organization. And when if I as a consultant had told people what the design team would come up with, which eliminated a lot of jobs, took a work process from like 130 steps down to 36 steps, right? If I had said as an outsider, here's what it's going to look like, they would have thrown me out. Nobody would have bought into it. But they have bought into it completely and enthusiastically because Larry Miller didn't present it, didn't do it. Larry Miller just asked the questions and facilitated the design team that now owns it. And they're going to make it work because they have ownership of it. So, creativity, overcoming resistance, successful change management to me, I mean, the most critical word is allowing people and enabling people to feel ownership for the process.
Hey, Larry, I'm going to agree with that and use a couple different ways to say that. What you did was that you didn't deal with the changes, you dealt with the changing. Change as a verb, not as a noun.
Change is the change.
Yeah, so change as the noun, the change, the thing I want, the thing the design team says, that's a threat. And people react to it as a threat. On the other hand, if you say, let's change, as in the verb to change, and how we're going to go about that changing, that resulted in what you described, which was an organization that now has a direction and a purpose. So I would underlie all of this by saying, from the brain perspective, your brain wants a solution, it wants an answer, it wants to act, and it wants to believe that it is right about what it's doing.
Both, yeah, okay, good, I like it. You don't want to get in trouble, dude. Okay, very good. Okay, we'll see you next time, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Mark, really appreciate it.
All right, thanks, George, and thanks everyone for being here again or the first time, and hope to see you next time.